They say tanking is easy. Just wall-to-wall pull, it's easy, Lamau. But is that always true? Indeed, there are a lot of large AoE, area of effect, pulls that can be done very easily, even without being very skilled as a tank. But there are also many that require at least some effort from both the tank and healer, and then there's the crazy ones. I have compiled some of the hardest wall-to-wall pulls, in my opinion, in this list, where I go over what the specific pull entails, if there are some varieties to it, perhaps how common it is to perform, and any particular reasons why a pull is so difficult. Also, do make sure to leave a comment with what you think is the scariest wall-to-wall pull in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 10. Vanaspati. Specifically the second pull at the start of the dungeon. The entire dungeon is dictated by a lot of forced single pack pulls and awkward wait times between packs. The final pack of the dungeon even being split up such that you need to kill something in the pack to make the rest of the pack spawn. However, the second pack of the dungeon is weirdly threatening, mainly because of the idolizers that do the majority of their damage at range, making the tank take significantly more damage than normal while pulling. This is further emphasized by the idolizers having significantly more HP than the rest of the pack, so they just stay alive for so long. Number 9. Dohm Mheg. You could even say that this dungeon itself has a ranking of dangerous AoE pulls, as the majority of the pulls in the dungeon each have some sort of scary detail to them. Starting with the least threatening of them, we have the first pull after the first boss. It starts with this bait and switch where the frog does not actually participate in combat, and then as you continue the pull, there's this massive pack of wasps dumped on you. None of the mobs in this pack are individually particularly threatening, however, the huge tree can easily block up your vision so that you cannot see that all of the wasps each cast a line AoE in front of them. And if you don't sidestep this, they are perfectly capable of wiping out anyone that finds themselves there. This is mostly effective only as a surprise attack though, so once you know this gimmick, this pack stops being super threatening. A tip to deal with this is that it is recommended that tanks pile all the mobs on one side of them, which would prevent the big tree from covering telegraphs from other enemies in the pack. The reason why the frog not participating in the fight can be surprising is that both of the packs at the start of the dungeon and the second pack after the first boss has a frog that casts an interruptible spell that massively boosts the power and size of one mob in the pack. Whether these pulls are particularly threatening in this dungeon are heavily dependent on whether this frog is interrupted or not. Notably, the way that interrupts work, as well as the visual of the cast time of flashing uninterruptible actions, was added in Shadowbringers, and even in Endwalker, it isn't like the game puts a significant amount of effort into teaching this interaction. As such, these pulls can be extremely difficult to deal with if no one bothers to interrupt the frog. Remember, tanks and ranged physical jobs have interrupts, so you will always have at least one person who can do this. However, for some reason, the frogs are immune to stuns, so don't bother trying that instead. Concentrating your AoE on the boosted mob by choosing it as your primary target can lead to it being killed off first, and that can be a somewhat effective way to deal with the worst case scenario. If your job has single target damage reduction options, or even stuns, that can also help. The most threatening pull in the dungeon, however, is the second pull after the second boss, featuring 2 kelpies, some frogs, and this naiad fellow. A pseudo 3-pack pull can be threatening in general just because of the size of the pull, but this is further emphasized because each of the horses use torpedo, which is like a mini tank buster, which can vastly increase their damage output. This can easily make this 7-mob pack feel like there's 9 or even 10 mobs. The rest of the pack mainly uses avoidable attacks, so the real threat here are the horses. While these packs could easily be split up and done in 2 parts, the awkward part is that individually each pack feels very underwhelming, so you're heavily incentivized to do this as one big pull. Number 8. Stone Vigil, specifically the section before the first boss. The difficulty of this dungeon is especially emphasized by the lack of tools healers have in this level range. Only astrologians and sages have reliable access to something while the tank is running and pulling, which is also further emphasized by how far you have to run between each pack of mobs. As this is an ARR dungeon, there is a severe lack of walls, and so technically you could freely choose between doing this section as 5 single packs, or AoE pull everything, or a mix. Due to the length of such a pull, the most common AoE pull is to pull the first 3 packs, and then the rest as a second pull. Or, alternatively, to pull the packs as 2, 2, and a 1 at the end. What makes the 3-pack pull particularly dangerous are the Durvanian outflyers, as they are perfectly capable of damaging the tank from range, which means the tank will be taking an unusually large amount of damage while pulling. There's also the weapon that can snipe multiple party members with its fire breath, and the fact that the tank has to turn multiple corners during the pull, which can make even a Sage or a Theologian feel somewhat helpless even with instant cast options. Before moving on, I want to give an honorable mention to the Giga pull at the end of the dungeon. Like the full 5 packs at the start, this pull requires a lot of running and isn't very common, but is very hard to pull off if you do attempt it as well. Number 7. Snow Cloak. In particular, the Giga pull you can do right at the start. The Spriggans have access to Blizzard, which they will still be able to cast while you are pulling. And on top of this, every single mob in this mega pack, every wolf, the Ibexes, even the Gobu, have access to mini tank busters that allow them to effectively swing twice at the tank every few seconds, which can make this pack of 10 mobs sometimes swing like 20 mobs all at once. Which is almost certainly the reason why the pack is usually dealt with by the tank using an invulnerability of some sort. An honorable mention also goes to the big pull after the first boss, as the sprites make it somewhat inconvenient to move the pack around, and the icy wind, which does damage to you, can easily be missed. Number 6. Aurum Vale. There are multiple individual annoying pulls throughout the dungeon, but nothing comes close to the danger presented in the very first room of the dungeon. The room is filled to the brim with mobs with different pulling criteria and very different ways of attack, which can make the room feel like disarming a bomb. An interesting, however completely irrelevant detail for most players is that only the frogs in the room can actually see you, meaning that unless you flat out bump into any of the plant-like creatures in the room, you can usually walk through the room as long as you sneak behind the frogs. This is typically done by walking an unusual path through the room. However, this also means that if you accidentally pull anything, you are in a much worse position than if you had just done the room normally, almost guaranteeing a wipe. What makes the room threatening even when done normally is that the frogs move in unpredictable ways, and when combined with the patrolling Veil Wasps, you can easily end up in a chain of accidental pulls, including, but not limited to, being yanked into the room by a frog turning just at the wrong moment. Other factors that can also make the room threatening is that the Eft stools regularly use a tank buster with no warning, which more than doubles the damage a mob of their level would normally deal. The Lilies of the Veil are also entirely ranged, meaning that you need to employ old school tactics like corner pulls to get them to a position where you can safely fight them. Or alternatively fight them where they are, positioned right next to a vent that regularly can push you further into the room, which is also situated right on the patrol path of Veil Wasps. This leads to the safest way to pass the room in a single motion being dashing along the left wall, intentionally pulling the Eft stools and the lilies on the path, and then passing into the boss room, utilizing the wall to force the enemies to you, which also means that you are untargetable by the healer until they catch up to you. As long as everyone sticks to the plan, this can work very consistently, even if you accidentally pull more mobs from the room. Number 5. Holminster Switch. Specifically, the second pull in the dungeon. This pull is mostly a numbers game, as the mobs simply hit very hard and there are many of them. This can be further exacerbated by the fact that it is the first dungeon in the expansion, so it isn't unusual for players to be mildly undergeared for it, and some jobs may feel like they're still lacking a crucial tool. However, there isn't much else to say than the pull appearing almost like a gear check. Number 4. Tower of Zod. Specifically, the final mega pull of the dungeon. The danger in this pull is very misleading because it is not the big airship or the big spider bot that are threatening. It's this motorcycle looking boy who regularly whacks you for a triple damage surprise attack every now and then. Aside from this, the pack is just extremely devastating in the same way as the Holminster Switch example. The mobs are really strong and you might be lacking a tool or be slightly undergeared. This is especially clear if the tank is only level 81 and not 82, so they're missing their new defensive cooldown. Number 3. Paglth'an. Specifically, the first pull of the dungeon. You know how there's a dragon that engages you halfway through the first big pull? Well, that's because it is busy breaking this rock. You can actually help it break the rock, allowing you to progress and pull more. This means that you can actually pull 4 packs, although you have to sit for a bit and bash the rock to do so. Both sets of packs are also made more difficult to deal with by the fact that there is a caster in each pair that you will have to move the pack to. If you pull all 4 packs, you will instead have to awkwardly shuffle the pack around to get the casters on top of each other, and then you can pile everything on top of each other. Remember, you're doing all this while having 4 packs worth of enemies bashing away. An honorable mention also goes to the rather large 2-pack pool at the end of the dungeon, although that one is just weirdly big for a somewhat normal pool. Number 2. Mount Gulg. Both the very first mega pool and the very last mega pool. For the first pool, it is a matter of a rather long run to get all the mobs, but also just a numbers game. There's a lot of mobs beating at the tank, so it can be hard if the damage output of the group can't deal with it in time before the tank and healer runs out of cooldowns. For the final pool, it is mostly the same. Long running time, many mobs bashing at you, but some of the mobs have interruptible casts, and should these go off, it can do party-wide damage, which can be concerning if anyone in the party has accidentally been hit by some of the AoEs on the floor from the blob of enemies. This means the healer can get distracted from focusing their healing on the tank if everything doesn't go to plan. Honorable mention: Amaurot. In particular because of the confusion that the fixating and chasing detonators and roilers can cause, and if not dealt with properly, can be the cause of further chaos. For those confused, the detonators add a stacking debuff that increases the damage of their detonation when they are killed. However, you can both reset the stacks by stunning the detonator, or if you kill it while it is stunned, it often doesn't explode at all. The roilers instead chase the healer around and weaken their healing output, so ignoring the roiler can lead to the tank randomly dying because the healer's tools are underwhelming. For the most part, running from these mobs does not help, so if you're fixated by them, the best you can do is position yourself so that they are on top of the rest of the pack, so the group is incentivized to cleave them down naturally. Also, note that one of the final packs also includes an idolizer like the ones from Vanaspati, and yes, it also hits really hard. Now then, number 1, Bardam's Mettle. Specifically, the first big pull in the dungeon. Similar to some of the other top ranked pulls in the video, this combines a long run when fully maximized and a lot of mobs. The Halgai shoots will also be pelting the tank with arrow casts while the tank is pulling, in a similar way to Stone Vigil. What further complicates this pull is that as it is the first pull of the dungeon, your tank and healer both want to hold back to have cooldowns for the next big pull, and simultaneously don't know for sure how the other plays with their tools yet. Bardam's Mettle is also the first dungeon in Stormblood that drops better gear than the Idleshare Poetics equipment, meaning that you could easily be considered undergeared, putting more weight on your skill than your gear. I also want to highlight the second pull after the first boss, as that pull can be quite devastating too. But because the second boss disables all actions, you're free to use every single cooldown you have on this big AoE pull without the risk of it coming back to bite you. This makes this pull a lot more manageable compared to the first one. To conclude on this video, I feel something that seems to be a recurring villain in dangerous wall-to-wall pulls are long runs to perform the pulls, especially if there are ranged mobs in the packs. And then, weirdly, once the pull is fully underway, the exact composition of the mobs tend to be a detail, as mob count tends to influence the danger the pack poses a lot more. The exception is, like we saw with Snow Cloak, if all the mobs have mini tank busters, or like in Tower of Zod, where one mob has a huge tank buster. That can easily surprise. Once again, I would love to hear about the big pulls you find the hardest to deal with in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, while I don't recommend it, and it is extremely rare to see, you can pull everything from the start of Sastasha up to the first boss. And if you work together, you can even spawn and pull the boss while all the mobs are still there. If both the tank and healer are geared, and the healer specifically a scholar, or perhaps an astrologian, this pull should be doable. But I do not recommend doing it without knowing your team.